What if I told you that the sweetness you add to your tea every morning could quietly shape your metabolism for years to come? Here's what actually happens. Inside your body, sweetness is never just flavor. It is a chemical signal that travels from your tongue to your brain, preparing organs for incoming energy. When you consume refined sugar, glucose floods rapidly into your bloodstream, pushing your pancreas to release a strong surge of insulin within minutes. That insulin acts like a key, unlocking cells to absorb glucose. But repeated surges begin to overwhelm the system over time. Cells gradually respond less efficiently, forcing the pancreas to produce even more insulin to manage the same amount of sugar. This pattern is one of the biological roots of metabolic syndrome, where blood sugar, blood pressure, and abdominal fat begin rising together. Excessive intake of added sweeteners becomes a primary driver of this cascade, especially when sugar is consumed daily in drinks and processed foods. As glucose repeatedly spikes, the liver converts excess sugar into triglycerides, packaging them into fat for storage. Over time, this contributes to weight gain, particularly visceral fat that wraps around internal organs like a tightening belt. That visceral fat is metabolically active, releasing inflammatory signals that further impair insulin sensitivity throughout the body. The heart feels the effects as well, because chronic high sugar intake increases cardiovascular kidney metabolic risk through complex hormonal interactions. Blood vessels exposed to frequent glucose spikes experience oxidative stress, subtly damaging their delicate inner lining. Meanwhile, the kidneys work harder to filter excess glucose from the bloodstream, placing strain on microscopic filtration units. Now imagine a different scenario, where sweetness arrives in smaller amounts and in a different biological package. Honey enters the body with glucose and fructose, but also trace enzymes, antioxidants, and plant compounds collected from nectar. These additional compounds do not transform honey into medicine, yet they slightly modify how the body processes its sugars. Because honey is sweeter than table sugar, smaller quantities can deliver the same perceived sweetness in food or drinks. When used carefully, this allows total sugar intake to decrease without removing sweetness entirely from daily life. The benefit only exists when honey replaces refined sugars in very small amounts, not when it simply adds more sweetness. Once consumed, honey's glucose still enters the bloodstream, and insulin is still released to manage it. However, the slower consumption patterns often associated with honey, like stirring into yogurt instead of drinking soda, can reduce rapid spikes. That difference matters because blood sugar stability is one of the pillars of long-term metabolic health. The American Heart Association highlights blood sugar management as central to life's essential 8 for cardiovascular protection. Inside muscle cells, steady glucose supply supports energy production through mitochondria without overwhelming cellular pathways. Mitochondria convert glucose into ATP, the energy currency that fuels movement, repair, and basic organ function. When glucose levels remain moderate, mitochondria operate efficiently, producing less oxidative stress and fewer harmful byproducts. But when glucose arrives in repeated surges, metabolic pathways become overloaded, increasing reactive oxygen species inside cells. Over time, this contributes to chronic inflammation, which quietly underlies diabetes and cardiovascular disease progression. Honey does not bypass these pathways. It still participates in the same biochemical reactions once absorbed. The key difference lies in quantity and context, not magical transformation inside the bloodstream. Fructose, one of honey's components, is processed primarily in the liver rather than circulating widely like glucose. In small amounts, the liver converts fructose into usable energy molecules without major disruption. In excess, however, fructose can accelerate fat production in the liver, contributing to fatty liver changes. This is why portion size determines whether honey plays a neutral role or contributes to metabolic strain. Zoom deeper into the pancreas, where beta cells sense rising glucose and release insulin in response. If blood sugar remains balanced, beta cells rest between meals, maintaining long-term functional resilience. When exposed to constant sugar intake, beta cells face continuous demand, gradually losing efficiency. That progressive decline is part of how type 2 diabetes develops over years, not overnight. Replacing refined sugar with small amounts of honey may reduce total intake, easing cumulative stress. But pouring honey generously over pancakes recreates the same metabolic burden as any other added sweetener. The body does not label molecules as natural or refined. It responds to chemical structure and dosage. Now shift to the brain, where sweetness activates dopamine pathways linked to reward and motivation. Frequent, intense sweetness recalibrates taste perception, making naturally sweet foods like fruit seem less satisfying. When sweetness intensity decreases gradually, taste receptors adapt, restoring sensitivity over time. Using modest honey instead of heavily sweetened processed foods can support that recalibration process. This behavioral shift may reduce overall sugar cravings, indirectly supporting metabolic stability. In the bloodstream, stable glucose reduces sharp insulin swings, which helps prevent energy crashes after meals. Energy stability influences daily movement, mood regulation, and appetite control in subtle but powerful ways. When insulin remains elevated for long periods, fat storage is promoted, while fat breakdown is suppressed. Lowering total added sugar intake even slightly can shift this hormonal balance towards better metabolic flexibility. Metabolic flexibility allows the body to switch between burning carbohydrates and stored fat more efficiently. Honey can fit into this framework only when it supports lower overall sugar exposure. Think of sweetness as a dial rather than a switch, adjusting how intensely your metabolism must respond. Each teaspoon becomes a small metabolic event, triggering hormonal signals that ripple through organs. Over months and years, those small events accumulate into meaningful physiological patterns. Choosing honey over refined sugar may reduce processed food consumption, which often carries additional additives. That indirect benefit can improve dietary quality beyond the sweetener itself. Still, honey remains concentrated sugar and contributes calories that influence weight when consumed in excess. Weight gain increases cardiovascular kidney metabolic risk through elevated blood pressure, lipid changes, and insulin resistance. Managing sweetness intake becomes a quiet but powerful lever for protecting heart and metabolic health. Instead of eliminating sweetness entirely, consider reducing overall volume while savoring smaller amounts intentionally. A thin drizzle in tea may satisfy just as effectively as 2 heaping spoonfuls of sugar. Over time, your taste buds adapt, and the same small amount feels more than enough. This approach aligns with the principle that managing blood sugar is central to long-term well-being. Honey is not a miracle substance, nor is it harmful by default. Its role depends on whether it replaces refined sugars in modest amounts or simply adds to excess. In the end, the healthiest sweetness strategy is not about chasing natural labels. It's about respecting how your biology responds to quantity, frequency, and daily habit patterns. When used thoughtfully and sparingly, honey can be part of a balanced approach to sweetness. And sometimes, protecting your metabolism begins with something as small as a single measured spoon.